Hello again. I have speculated before on the obsession which the producers of films, plays and television dramas set in Britain in the past have with ensuring that black people are always present and invariably grossly overrepresented. This is only done with black people and never with Indians or Chinese people, which is in itself sufficient to indicate that there is some agenda behind the thing. There are no efforts to persuade viewers that Indian people have always been common on the streets of this country. It is always, and only, people of African heritage with whom this is done. The latest example of this game may be seen in the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of John Masefield's children's novel, The Box of Delights. The poster for this may be seen in the description to this video, and it will be observed that 2/3 of those featured on it are black. This is weird, for the book itself was published in 1935 and the play being produced is set at that time. It centres around the adventures of a boy returning home from boarding school. This just by itself makes the casting a little odd for the play. How many black teenagers do viewers think that there were at boarding schools in Britain during the 1930s? How many black teenagers do they think there were at all in the entire country? This makes the whole thing immediately anachronistic and distracts our attention. There were hardly any black people in Britain in the 1930s, and those there were tended to be adults rather than children or young people. Even as late as the 1960s, it was possible to live one's life entirely in Britain and never set eyes on a black person at all. This means that the casting of black people in these two leading roles has been done for a purpose. And that purpose is not to recreate the lost era of 1930s Britain. It is to make a point for modern audiences. Here is another thing to consider. Although there were hardly any black people in this country at that time, there were around 7,000 people of Indian heritage in Britain in 1931. There are far more Indians in Britain today than there are people of African heritage, and this was even more so in the 1930s. Whenever a person of colour is introduced into some production of this kind, though, whether it is The Box of Delights or The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, it is always black children who are featured, and never Indian ones. This is peculiar. Has anybody ever asked themselves why it is that when an ethnic minority is introduced into one of these dramas, it is almost invariably a black person and never an Indian? One possibility which has occurred to me, and I've spoken of this before, is that when people make films and television programmes, they're always thinking of the chances that they have of selling them to the United States. And since 15% of the people in America are African Americans, it makes sense to have black people rather than Indian ones featured prominently. This kind of thing is likely to be a permanent feature of life in the future because many companies in the industry now have specific contracts in which it is required that they have a certain proportion of ethnic minority actors and staff. Without this, people will be reluctant to deal with them. If I was Indian, I might be inclined to find all this a little irritating. Indian people have a very long history indeed in Britain and have had far larger communities than people of African heritage, and for a lot longer. Somehow, though, nobody wishes to employ them so readily in advertisements, films and television programmes.